Hi, folks. Welcome to the next episode of my Richard Layman book reviews. And today I want to talk about book number 23 on my list, which is 1985's Beware. Now, I've mentioned before that Layman wrote three novels very early in his career. One of which, his first novel, The Cellar, was published in 1980, written in 1978. And he wrote two other novels that same year in 1978. They'd been novels that he'd been working on, I believe, since the mid 70s, which were both rejected. One of which turned out to be All Hallows Eve, released in 1985, but written in 1978. The other one was this book, Beware, also released in 1985, very popular for Layman. It was really starting to pick up traction, having all these books coming out. But this one was also initially a rejected novel, like I say, released in 1985, written in 1978. And this one is one I'm very on the fence about. I actually like it, but don't quite like it enough to say I think it's a recommended good novel. It's kind of still in this middle of the pack of Layman stuff. It's a story of an invisible man, the subject of an experiment. I think he was an assassin for a cult, and goes on the run. And he is, I think, one of the, if not the nastiest of all of Layman's creations. I think there's only one or two that we haven't got to yet that possibly rival him, because being invisible gives him carte blanche to do all sorts of horrific Layman-esque things. And this guy is just absolutely sadistic, murderous, rapey, just a truly horrible human being who's doing everything he can because he's invisible and he can get away with it. But he's also on the run from this cult that are after him because he's kind of betrayed them and they want him dead. So he keeps moving. And yeah, it's a completely bonkers story, really, because you've also got this, I think she's a reporter. She gets caught up in this story whereby there's been what people think is some sort of poltergeist activity. It turns out to be him. She's attacked and has all the stuff done that Layman's characters do, and she goes on the run, and this guy goes after her because he wants her, and she teams up with a writer who is just so happens to know this sort of ex-marine who's already on the trail of this cult, and they all somehow get caught up, including this invisible man, in this sort of escape from this cult that are after the lot of them, which ends up in some sort of shootout in the desert. Now, if that sounds mad, then that's because that's what this book is. It is absolutely and utterly insane. It's one of Layman's most mental storylines. It really is. It's a short book. It's also a very fast read. There's lots going on. It's just wall-to-wall action. This book reminds me of an action movie in terms of the fact that it literally is very visual and visceral, very easy to visualize what's going on, very easy to keep a track of, even though it is bonkers. And it's the sort of thing that you could imagine could have been released in the early 80s as a sort of like horror sort of action film. It really is a very sort of entertaining read in that sense. It's ludicrous and it's all a little bit unbelievable, but it is fun in that sense. The reason why this finds itself lower down on this ranking than perhaps it sounds like it would have been is for the sole fact, nothing to do with the way it's written or the storyline or any of that. It's for the sole fact that this is just such a thoroughly nasty book. Layman, I've mentioned when I talked about Island, had a habit of trying to be as violent and as sexual as possible in some of his books, in an attempt, I think, just to shock, because he has a very limited palette of tricks that he can use in order to convey horror. He does what he does very well. He's extremely good at action. He's very easy to read, but he's quite limited in what he can do. And he kind of, you do realise after reading a lot of Layman books that he has some very familiar tricks. Making female characters subject to sexual assault is almost always the way in which you can guarantee a female is going to be in peril and a male is going to be evil. And it's always it starts to become a little bit tiresome after a while. And his male characters being often very rapey is a bit off-putting in terms of how I described it before in Ireland. There's all the sort of voyeurism and all of the sort of perviness that you'd expect from a scene like that, but with none of the effects, none of the psychological insight, none of the depth, none of the real-world horror of it. It's almost like he I don't want to say gleefully wrote this stuff to try and shock people, but it's as if he could only write stuff like this to shock, and he didn't know how to go above it because it starts to become tiresome rather than shocking. It's a bit disturbing in some ways, but it starts to become tiresome. And this one's got an unhealthy amount of those sort of scenes, even depicting. He's being as he's invisible as well. You can imagine it goes to some pretty dark places, but he even briefly talks about some girls that are underage and stuff, and it's all a little bit icky and unpleasant, and I don't know, it throws me out of the story a little bit because it just doesn't need to be there. There's a brilliant scene, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold going. There's a brilliant scene in which, set in this hotel, this invisible man's got an axe and he's just hacking people left, right and centre while there's a fire behind him going on. You can't see him, there's a fire, there's smoke everywhere, there's his axe flying through the air, hacking people to bits, there's a huge body count. Genuinely terrifying to think an invisible psychopath doing that sort of stuff and you not being aware of what's going on. Really, really scary stuff. Things like that, the action, the violence, doesn't need the constant need to have people being molested and raped, and to make those scenes so voyeuristic. It kind of comes across as a little bit lazy. And for those reasons, I've rated this book lower than I would have done, because without those scenes, this would have been a better book. It would have been a more enjoyable read for me. So it's still an okay horror book, despite the fact it's mad. But you need to be aware of those scenes going into it, that this is pretty explicit and unpleasant in a lot of places. And I just felt like it would have been better without that stuff in. But still a decent book. The heart and basics of it are okay. So that's why it finds itself here on this list. But just be aware of it when you go into it, that this is one of the nastier books that Lehman's wrote. Certainly one of his nastier characters. He has wrote a few books that are even nastier than this, and I will talk about them in turn. But they do have qualities which set them apart from this, so they are better books. But that's Beware from 1985.